Take it off, or I will have it removed for you." The judge's voice struck the room like a gavel before the gavel even moved, sharp, controlled, and laced with a confidence that had never been challenged in this space, as the fluorescent lights hummed overhead and flattened every color into something pale and lifeless, the quiet rustle of paperwork and the faint squeak of shifting chairs filling the silence that followed, and at the center of it all sat Thomas Hale, 82 years old, his frame thin but upright in the wheelchair, his hands resting on the armrests with a faint tremor that spoke of time rather than weakness, his eyes fixed not on the man towering above him behind the polished bench, but on the American flag standing in the corner, its fabric barely moving in the still, conditioned air, as if even it were holding its breath. Judge Richard Halvorson leaned forward slightly, fingers pressed together, studying the small, worn piece of metal pinned to Thomas's jacket with an expression that hovered somewhere between irritation and amusement, the kind reserved for things he had already decided were insignificant. "This courtroom is not a stage," he continued, his tone tightening, each word measured, deliberate, "and we do not entertain personal displays meant to influence proceedings." A faint murmur rippled through the room, subtle but undeniable, people shifting just enough to acknowledge that something was off, something that didn't sit right, though no one could quite name it yet, and Thomas said nothing, not immediately, his breathing slow, steady, as if the weight of the moment had no authority over him, as if he had learned long ago that pressure revealed more about others than it ever did about him. A clerk coughed softly, the sound swallowed quickly, while somewhere in the back a pen tapped twice against a legal pad before stopping abruptly, and still the old man remained still, his gaze unwavering, his silence stretching just long enough to become uncomfortable, just long enough to expose the impatience in the room, until finally, without turning his head, without raising his voice, he spoke. It stays, the words quiet, almost gentle, yet carrying a certainty that didn't ask for permission, didn't seek approval, and didn't offer explanation, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered across the judge's face, not doubt, not yet, but irritation sharpened into something colder, something more personal, as if the refusal itself were an offense rather than the object in question. "That was not a request," Halvorson replied, his voice rising just enough to reclaim the space, "to remind everyone present who held authority here, you will comply with the court or you will be held in contempt." The word hung heavy, practiced, powerful in ordinary circumstances, but the man in the wheelchair did not react, did not shift, did not even blink, and that stillness began to draw more attention than any argument could have, people leaning slightly, eyes narrowing, trying to understand why this quiet figure seemed untouched by the pressure that defined the room, why his presence felt anchored while everything else felt performative. The judge exhaled through his nose, a controlled release of frustration, before gesturing toward the metal with a dismissive flick of his hand. "What is it, exactly?" he said, the edge of mockery no longer hidden. "Some kind of keepsake, a souvenir meant to impress." A faint chuckle slipped from somewhere near the side benches, quickly stifled, but not unnoticed, and in that moment, the courtroom shifted, subtle but real, from procedure to spectacle, from law to something closer to judgment without understanding, and Thomas's hand moved, slowly, deliberately, not to remove the metal, but to rest lightly over it, fingers brushing the worn metal as if confirming something only he could feel, his eyes lowering just slightly, not in submission, but in memory, as if the room had already faded for him, replaced by something far older, far heavier, something no one else present had earned the right to question. And near the back row, a young man in a slightly oversized suit straightened in his seat, his brow tightening as his gaze locked onto that small piece of metal, something about it pulling at a memory he couldn't quite place yet. A detail out of context but impossible to ignore, and as the judge prepared to speak again, to push harder, to assert control one more time, the air itself seemed to tighten, the quiet no longer empty but charged, as if the room were standing on the edge of something it did not yet understand, something already in motion long before anyone realized it had begun. The judge's patience snapped in small, controlled fractures, visible only in the tightening of his jaw, and the slight shift of his shoulders as he leaned back into his chair, the polished wood creaking faintly beneath the movement. "Bailiff," he said, his tone no longer edged but solid, final, the kind of voice that expected immediate compliance, "assist Mr. Hale in removing that item," and the words seemed to settle over the room like a weight, pressing down on every quiet observer who had chosen to remain still. The bailiff hesitated for just a fraction of a second, a man caught between duty and something less definable, something instinctive. Before stepping forward, his boots soft against the carpet, his presence large but careful as he approached the wheelchair. "Sir," he said quietly, not unkind, "let us not make this harder than it needs to be." But Thomas Hale did not turn, did not acknowledge him right away, his hand still resting over the metal, fingers lightly curved as if shielding it from more than just physical contact, and when he finally spoke, his voice was the same. Low, steady tone that carried no strain, no urgency. "You do not understand what you are asking," and the statement was not defiant, not emotional, but factual, like a man describing the weather to someone standing indoors. Across the room, a woman shifted in her seat, her brow furrowed as she leaned slightly toward the person beside her, whispering something that never quite formed into words, while the young man in the back, Ethan Cole, felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the courtroom itself, his eyes fixed on the metal now, really seeing it for the first time, not as decoration, but as something worn, something carried, the edges dulled not by neglect but by time, and a faint recognition stirred somewhere in the back of his mind, a memory of his father's study, of framed photographs and quiet conversations about honors that were never spoken of lightly. "This is your final warning," Judge Halvorson said, his voice rising just enough to reclaim control. Though there was something thinner beneath it now, something less certain than before. "You are in violation of court protocol, and I will not tolerate defiance in my courtroom." And still, Thomas did not move, did not lift his eyes, did not offer the explanation that everyone in the room seemed to be waiting for, because explanations were for those who needed validation, and he had long since moved beyond that need, and the silence that followed stretched longer this time, heavier, filled not with confusion but with something closer to anticipation, as if the room itself had begun to sense that it was standing at the edge of a line that should not be crossed. Ethan shifted forward in his seat, his fingers curling slightly against his knee as the unease sharpened into something more focused, more urgent, and without fully realizing why, he stood, the movement subtle but enough to draw a glance from the person beside him, and then another, as he stepped quietly toward the aisle, his mind already moving ahead of his actions, piecing together fragments that refused to stay separate, the metal, the name, the calm, the refusal, and somewhere deep in that pattern was something he recognized but could not yet fully name, and as the bailiff reached out, hesitant but committed, Ethan turned, slipping out through the side door of the courtroom, the heavy wood closing behind him with a muted thud that no one inside seemed to register, and in the hallway, the air felt different, cooler, quieter, as if removed from the tension building just beyond the wall, and his hand moved quickly now, pulling his phone free, his thumb hovering for only a moment before selecting a contact he had never once considered using in a situation like this. And as the line began to ring, he glanced back toward the closed door, his pulse steady but elevated, a single thought anchoring itself in his mind with growing certainty. If he was right, then what was happening inside that room was not just a mistake, it was something far worse, something that was already too far in motion to stop without consequence. The hallway swallowed the sound of the courtroom the moment the door clicked shut behind Ethan Cole, leaving only the low hum of overhead lights and the distant echo of footsteps somewhere far down the corridor, and for a brief second he stood still, phone pressed to his ear, listening to the steady ring that now felt louder than it should have, each tone stretching longer, heavier, as doubt tried to push its way into his thoughts, but it did not take hold, because the image of that metal, worn and unpolished yet carried with absolute certainty, refused to let go. And then the line picked up, a voice on the other end, calm, controlled, professional. "Colonel Harris," it said, and Ethan straightened slightly without realizing it, instinct taking over where uncertainty had been moments before. "Sir, this is Ethan Cole. I apologize for the interruption, but I need to confirm something immediately." There was a pause, not long, but deliberate, the kind of silence that measured intent before offering attention. "Go ahead," the voice replied, and Ethan exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. "I am in courtroom 3B, there is an elderly man, Thomas Hale, he is being ordered to remove a military decoration, and I believe," he hesitated, not because he lacked conviction, but because he understood the weight of what he was about to say, "I believe it may be something significant." Another pause followed, longer this time, the faintest shift in the line as if the man on the other end had changed position. "Describe it," Colonel Harris said, his tone no longer casual, and Ethan closed his eyes briefly, recalling every detail he could. It is small, worn, attached to a faded blue ribbon, not polished, not ceremonial, but, it does not look like anything I have seen displayed casually. Silence answered him again, but this time it was different, not passive, not distant, it was focused, active, and when the voice returned, it had changed, subtle but undeniable. Stay where you are, Harris said, each word precise, controlled. Do not let anything else happen until I call you back. The line went dead before Ethan could respond, leaving him standing there with the phone still pressed to his ear, the weight of the moment settling fully into place now, no longer uncertain, no longer abstract, and behind the closed courtroom door, the tension had only continued to build, the bailiff's hand hovering inches from Thomas Hale's chest, close enough to feel the presence of the object beneath his palm. Yet not touching it, as if something unseen held him back. Sir, he said again, quieter now, almost cautious, please, but Thomas did not move, his hand still resting lightly over the metal, his posture unchanged, and across the room, Judge Halvorsen watched with a growing impatience that now carried a trace of something else, something he did not recognize and therefore could not control. This delay is unnecessary, the judge snapped, his voice cutting through the room again, sharper this time. Proceed, and the command hung there, heavy and absolute, yet the room no longer responded the way it had before, the subtle shift already in motion, unnoticed by most but undeniable to those paying close attention, attention that no longer came from authority but from the possibility that authority itself was about to be questioned, and just beyond the courtroom walls, somewhere far removed from the quiet order of civil procedure, a different chain had already begun to move, silent, efficient, and entirely indifferent to the expectations of anyone inside that room. The moment stretched thin, like a wire pulled too tight, as the bailiff's hand hovered just short of contact, his fingers uncertain now, no longer guided by routine but by something quieter, something instinctive that he could not explain, and in that hesitation the entire room seemed to shift, the air no longer neutral but charged, as if every person present could feel that something unseen had entered the space. Something that did not belong to procedure or protocol, and Judge Halvorsen noticed it, even if he did not understand it, his eyes narrowing slightly as he leaned forward again, impatience sharpening into something more deliberate. I will not repeat myself, he said, his voice lower now but heavier, pressing down on the room with controlled force. This court will proceed as ordered, and yet the authority in his tone meant something it could not move, something that did not react the way it should have. Because Thomas Hale remained exactly as he was, unmoved, unshaken. His hand still resting over the metal with the same quiet certainty, his breathing steady, his gaze lowered just enough to suggest distance rather than submission, as if the moment unfolding around him had already been measured and dismissed long before it began. Across the room, a faint shift rippled through the spectators, subtle movements, shoulders adjusting, eyes exchanging glances that carried questions no one dared to speak aloud. While the clerk at the side of the room paused mid-note, pen hovering above the paper, her attention no longer on the record but on the man in the wheelchair, and in that silence, even the smallest sound seemed amplified, the soft hum of the lights, the distant creak of the building settling, the quiet exhale of someone holding tension. They could not name. The bailiff drew in a slow breath, his hand lowering slightly but not retreating, caught between command and conscience, and for the first time, he looked not at the judge, not at the room, but directly at Thomas, searching for something in the old man's face, some sign that would make sense of the situation, but what he found instead was absence, not emptiness, but the absence of fear, the absence of urgency, the absence of any need to explain himself to anyone present. And that absence unsettled him more than resistance ever could. Sir, he said again, softer now, the edge gone from his voice, replaced by something closer to respect, though he did not yet realize it. Help me understand. And Thomas lifted his eyes just slightly, not enough to challenge, not enough to confront, but enough to meet the moment with quiet clarity. You are standing in a place that believes authority comes from position, he said, his voice calm, measured, each word deliberate. But some things do not answer to position, and the words landed differently than anything spoken before, not loud, not dramatic, but carrying a weight that settled into the room like something remembered rather than introduced. Judge Halvorsen's expression tightened again, this time not with irritation alone, but with something closer to discomfort, the kind that comes when control begins to slip in ways that cannot be immediately corrected, and before he could respond, before he could reassert the structure he relied on. The heavy courtroom doors behind the gallery opened with a low, deliberate sound, not rushed, not forced, but precise, and every head in the room turned at once, drawn not by noise, but by presence, as a man stepped inside, his posture straight, his movement controlled, dressed not in the formal black of the court but in something simpler, darker, yet carrying an unmistakable authority that did not need announcement, and he paused just inside the doorway. His gaze sweeping the room once, quickly, efficiently, before settling on Thomas Hale, and in that brief, silent moment, something passed across his face, recognition, sharp and immediate, and the tension that had been building quietly now shifted direction entirely, no longer contained within the courtroom, but expanding outward, as if the room itself had just become part of something much larger than anyone inside had anticipated. The man did not rush, did not announce himself, and yet the moment he stepped fully into the room, something subtle but undeniable shifted, like a current changing direction beneath still water, his presence cutting through the stale rhythm of the courtroom without a single raised voice, and Judge Halvorsen straightened instinctively, not in recognition, not yet, but in response to something he could not immediately categorize. "This is a closed proceeding," the judge said, his tone returning to formality, though a trace of uncertainty lingered beneath it. "Identify yourself," and the man took 2 measured steps forward, his shoes making almost no sound against the floor, his gaze never leaving Thomas Hale, as if the rest of the room had already fallen away. "Colonel Daniel Harris," he said, his voice calm, even, carrying none of the tension that had filled the space moments before, and a ripple moved through the spectators. Quiet but sharp, the title alone enough to shift attention. To recalibrate assumptions that had been settled only seconds earlier, the bailiff stepped back without being told, his hand lowering completely now, retreating not in defeat but in recognition that whatever line he had been about to cross was no longer his to approach, and across the room, the clerk lowered her pen entirely, her focus fixed on the unfolding exchange, while the judge leaned forward slightly, regaining a measure of composure. "Colonel, unless you have business before this court, I will ask you to," but Harris did not look at him, did not acknowledge the interruption, his attention locked on the man in the wheelchair, and for the first time since the proceedings began, Thomas Hale shifted, not much, just enough to lift his eyes fully, and the 2 men regarded each other in silence, a moment that stretched far longer than it should have, far longer than any procedural exchange would allow, and yet no one moved to break it, because something in that silence felt deliberate, meaningful, as if it carried weight that did not belong to this room. "Sir," Harris said finally, and the word was not casual, not polite, it was precise, anchored in something deeper than formality, and Thomas gave the slightest nod, not acknowledgement of authority, but recognition of understanding, and that single exchange, quiet as it was, landed harder than anything spoken before, because it reframed everything, shifted the balance of the room without explanation, without announcement. Judge Halvorsen's expression tightened again, but this time it was different, no longer rooted in irritation alone, but in the growing realization that control was slipping in a way he could not immediately correct. "Colonel," he repeated, more firmly now, "this is a legal proceeding, and I will not have it disrupted," and Harris turned then, slowly, deliberately, his gaze settling on the judge with a calm that carried no challenge and yet offered no concession. "With respect, Your Honor," he said, and the phrase sounded less like deference and more like structure, like a boundary being drawn rather than a courtesy extended. "This matter has already moved beyond your jurisdiction." The words landed clean, without emphasis, but their meaning spread through the room like a sudden drop in temperature, and for a moment, no one spoke, no one moved, because the implication was clear even if it had not yet been fully understood, and somewhere beyond the walls of the courthouse, far removed from the quiet tension of that room, a system had already begun to respond, not loudly, not visibly, but with the kind of precision that did not require explanation, and inside, every person present could feel it now, the unmistakable sense that what had started as a simple order had become something else entirely, something that was no longer contained within the authority of a single man behind a bench. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality that no one could immediately respond to, as if Colonel Harris had not raised his voice yet somehow silenced everything that had come before, and Judge Halvorsen leaned back slowly, his fingers tightening against the edge of the bench, the practiced confidence in his posture now carrying a fracture, subtle but unmistakable. "This court does not yield authority based on implication," he said, his tone measured but sharper than before, an attempt to reclaim ground that was already shifting beneath him, and Harris regarded him for a moment, not dismissive, not confrontational, but steady, as if weighing whether explanation was even necessary. Before speaking again, "It is not implication, Your Honor," he said calmly, "it is recognition," and the distinction hung in the air, precise and deliberate, and for a second, no one in the room seemed to breathe, because the difference between those two words was not procedural, it was foundational. Thomas Hale remained still at the center of it all, his hand still resting lightly over the metal, his posture unchanged, but there was something different now, not in him, but in how the room perceived him, the quiet no longer mistaken for weakness, the stillness no longer read as compliance, but as something far more deliberate, something that had been waiting, not resisting, not reacting, simply allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it would. Across the room, Ethan Cole re-entered through the side door, his movements quick but controlled, his eyes immediately finding Colonel Harris, and when their gazes met, Harris gave the slightest nod, a confirmation that required no words, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest shifting from uncertainty to clarity, as if a line had been drawn and he now understood exactly which side of it he stood on. The judge noticed the exchange, his attention narrowing, his instincts sharp enough to recognize alignment when he saw it, even if he did not yet understand its source. "If there is some claim being made here," Halvorsen said, his voice firm again, though now anchored more in defense than control, "then it will be presented properly, through the appropriate legal channels," and Harris took a single step forward, not toward the bench, but toward Thomas, positioning himself just slightly to the side, not shielding, not blocking, but standing in a way that redefined the space itself. "It already has been," he replied, and at that exact moment, as if timed to the sentence rather than coincidence, a faint vibration passed through the judge's desk, the subtle buzz of a secure line activating, and Halvorsen's eyes flicked down instinctively, irritation giving way to confusion as he saw the indicator, a line rarely used, a line reserved for communication that did not wait, did not schedule, did not request. The room held still as he reached for it, the movement slower now, more deliberate, as if some part of him already understood that whatever was on the other end of that call would not fit within the boundaries he was used to controlling, and when he lifted the receiver, his voice returned to formality out of habit rather than certainty. "Judge Halvorsen," he said, but the response on the other end came immediately, precise, unmistakable, and though the words were not loud, not broadcast, their effect was visible in real time, the judge's posture shifting, his expression tightening, the color in his face changing ever so slightly, as if the foundation he had been standing on moments ago had just been replaced with something far less certain. And across the room, no one spoke, no one moved, because even without hearing the conversation, they could see it happening, the transfer of weight, the quiet but undeniable shift of authority from one place to another, and at the center of it all, Thomas Hale remained exactly as he had been from the beginning, unmoved, unshaken, as if the outcome had never been in question, only the timing. The judge's hand remained on the receiver longer than necessary, his fingers tightening slightly around it as the voice on the other end continued, calm, measured, and entirely uninterested in negotiation, and whatever was being said was not loud, not aggressive, yet it carried a weight that pressed visibly into him, stripping away the practiced rhythm of authority he had relied on moments before. And when he finally spoke again, his voice had changed, not in volume, but in certainty. "Yes, I understand," he said, slower now, each word chosen carefully, as if precision had suddenly become more important than control, and across the room, every eye remained fixed on him, watching the transformation unfold in real time without needing to hear a single word from the call itself. Colonel Harris did not move, did not shift his posture, his attention steady, his presence anchoring the moment rather than driving it. And beside him, Ethan Cole stood still, his earlier urgency replaced by a quiet awareness that what he had set in motion was now far beyond his reach, far beyond anything he could influence directly. The judge swallowed once, a subtle motion that might have gone unnoticed in any other moment, before lowering the receiver back into place with a care that bordered on hesitation, and for a brief second, he remained still, as if recalibrating, as if searching for the version of the room that had existed before the call, but it was gone, replaced by something else entirely, something he could not reshape with tone or command. "This matter," he began, his voice steady but no longer sharp, will be reconsidered, the pause in the sentence small but significant, the choice of words deliberate, and it echoed differently than any ruling he had issued before, not as a decision, but as an adjustment, and the shift did not go unnoticed, a ripple passing through the spectators, quiet but unmistakable, as people exchanged glances that now carried understanding rather than confusion. The bailiff stepped back another half step, fully disengaging now, his earlier uncertainty resolved into something clearer, something closer to respect, while the clerk lowered her gaze briefly, not in dismissal, but in acknowledgement, as if the record she had been keeping no longer captured the full weight of what had occurred. Thomas Hale remained exactly where he had been, his hands still resting lightly over the metal, his posture unchanged, but the space around him felt different now, no longer defined by scrutiny, no longer framed by doubt, but by recognition that had arrived without announcement and settled without resistance. Judge Halvorsen looked toward Colonel Harris, not with defiance, not even with irritation, but with a careful neutrality that had replaced the earlier certainty. If there is additional context that this court has not been made aware of, he said, choosing his words with precision, then it would appear appropriate to acknowledge it, and Harris inclined his head slightly, not as permission, but as confirmation that the shift was understood, that the boundary had been redrawn and recognized on both sides. The silence that followed was no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but heavy with meaning, the kind that comes after a realization rather than before it, and somewhere deep within that quiet, the entire room seemed to understand, without explanation, that what had been mistaken for defiance was never defiance at all, and what had been challenged was never meant to be defended, only recognized when the moment finally caught up to it. The shift did not arrive with noise or spectacle, but with something quieter, something far more unsettling to those who had grown accustomed to controlling a room through presence alone, as Judge Halvorsen adjusted his posture once more, not to assert authority this time, but to align himself with a reality that had already moved past him, his gaze drifting briefly toward the metal, then back to Thomas Hale, as if seeing him clearly for the first time rather than as a disruption to procedure. And when he spoke again, the words carried none of the earlier edge. "Mr. Hale," he said, slower now, more deliberate, "it appears there are considerations beyond the scope of this court that were not previously presented," and the phrasing was careful, measured, not an apology, not yet, but a recognition of misalignment, and that alone was enough to change the atmosphere entirely. The spectators leaned in almost imperceptibly, drawn not by tension anymore, but by the quiet gravity of a moment turning inward, becoming something reflective rather than confrontational, while the clerk resumed her pen only to pause again, as if uncertain whether what was unfolding could even be properly recorded in the language she had been trained to use. Colonel Harris remained at Thomas's side, not imposing, not directing, simply present, and that presence now carried context, a silent confirmation of everything that had not been said, and Thomas, for the first time since the beginning of the proceedings, shifted his hand slightly, not removing it from the metal, but easing its grip. As if the need to protect it had passed, replaced by something calmer, something resolved. "There was never anything to present," Thomas said quietly, his voice steady, unhurried, and every word landed with clarity. "Some things are not meant to be explained in rooms like this," and the statement did not challenge the court, did not diminish it, but instead placed it within a larger frame, one that extended beyond rules and jurisdiction into something older, something earned rather than granted. Judge Halvorsen nodded once, a small motion, but one that carried more weight than any ruling he had issued that day, his hands resting now on the surface of the bench not as tools of command, but as anchors, as if grounding himself in a space that had changed without his permission. "Then this court will proceed accordingly," he said, and the words no longer sounded like control, but like adjustment, like alignment with something he had not created but could no longer ignore. Across the room, Ethan Cole let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, his shoulders lowering slightly as the tension released not in a rush, but in a slow, steady unwind, the kind that follows understanding rather than victory, and around him, the other observers seemed to mirror that shift, their expressions softening, their posture easing, as the invisible pressure that had filled the room gave way to something quieter, something closer to respect. The bailiff stepped back fully now, his role complete not through action, but through restraint, his earlier hesitation now understood not as uncertainty, but as instinct, and the space between him and Thomas remained untouched, unbroken, as if it had never been his to cross in the first place, and through it all, Thomas Hale sat as he had from the beginning, unchanged, his presence steady, his silence intact, not because he had resisted the moment, but because he had never belonged to it in the way others had assumed, and as the courtroom settled into its new shape, into a version of itself that had been quietly redefined without announcement, one truth became clear to everyone present, not spoken, not declared, but understood in the stillness that followed, that respect had not been granted in that room, it had simply been recognized, finally, when everything else had fallen away. No one moved to speak immediately after the judge's final words settled into the room, because the silence that followed was no longer empty, it was full, layered with understanding that had not been there before, and for the first time since the proceedings began, the courtroom did not feel like a place of authority being exercised, but a place of perspective being corrected, and Judge Halvorsen sat still for a moment longer, his hands resting flat against the bench, his gaze lingering not on the documents before him, but on Thomas Hale, as if measuring the distance between what he had assumed and what he now understood, and when he finally straightened, there was no sharpness left in the movement, no urgency, only intention. "Mr. Hale," he said, his voice steady, quieter than before but far more grounded, "this court recognizes that certain honors carry weight beyond documentation," and the statement, simple as it was, carried more sincerity than anything he had said that day. Because it was not constructed, it was adjusted, shaped by what he had just been forced to confront. Thomas did not respond immediately, his eyes still resting somewhere beyond the room, as if the acknowledgement, while accurate, had arrived too late to change anything that mattered, and yet he gave the slightest nod, not in acceptance of authority, but in acknowledgement of understanding. A subtle exchange that closed a distance no argument ever could. Colonel Harris shifted his stance just slightly, his role now complete, his presence no longer needed to hold the space as firmly as before, and for the first time since he had entered, his posture softened, not in relaxation, but in resolution, and he turned his attention briefly toward Ethan Cole, who stood near the aisle, still absorbing the weight of everything that had unfolded, and in that brief glance, there was something unspoken but clear, a recognition that the decision to act had mattered, that the moment had required someone to notice, and he had. The spectators began to move again, slowly, cautiously, as if testing whether the room had truly changed or if the moment might still shift back, but it did not, the atmosphere holding steady in its new form, quieter, more grounded, as conversations resumed in low tones, no longer driven by curiosity, but by reflection. The bailiff stepped aside completely now, no longer part of the center of the room, his earlier hesitation now understood not as uncertainty, but as instinct that had guided him away from a line he was never meant to cross, and the clerk resumed her writing, her pen moving again across the page, though the record she was keeping could not capture the full weight of what had taken place, because what had changed was not procedure, but perception. Thomas Hale adjusted his position slightly in the wheelchair, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but it marked the end of something, not the end of conflict, but the end of misunderstanding, and as he turned the chair just a few degrees, preparing to leave, the room seemed to make space for him without being asked, a quiet path forming not through instruction, but through recognition, and as he moved forward, slow and steady, the faint sound of the wheels against the floor blending into the softened hum of the room, no one stopped him, no one questioned him, because there was nothing left to challenge, nothing left to prove, and as he passed beneath the flag that had held his gaze from the beginning, its fabric still and silent above him, one truth lingered in the minds of everyone present, not spoken, not written, but understood in a way that would not fade easily, that respect had never been created in that courtroom, it had simply arrived, carried in quietly by a man who had no need to announce